Autumn 1945. The war had ended, but in the minds of the captured women from Germany, surrender was still an unhealed wound. For months they had lived with hunger gnawing at their bodies and shame pressing on their souls. They had crossed an ocean they never imagined they would see, herded into transport ships, seasick and silent, bracing themselves for punishment. They believed they would be treated with cruelty. Instead, what awaited them in America was something they could never have imagined. Among them was Litzel Muller, only 23 years old, yet already with the lined face of someone who had lived through famine, fire, and loss. Her younger brother had died the previous winter, not from bullets or bombs, but from hunger itself. Bread in Germany had become a mockery, flour mixed with sawdust, dark loaves that crumbled into dust. Her last memories of Dresden before leaving were of neighbors boiling weeds, mothers trading wedding rings for a handful of potatoes, and children with eyes too large for their thin faces. When the camp gates in America closed behind them, Litzel expected more of the same: watery soup, endless hunger, a slow wasting away. Instead, she was led with the other women into a low building with wide doors. It smelled of warmth, and something else, something she did not immediately recognize. When those doors opened fully, Litzel stopped breathing. Inside stretched a hall lined with long counters, and on those counters was food, real food, more than she had seen in years. Loaves of bread, golden and steaming. Pots of stew so thick the ladles stood upright. Bowls of apples, their skins red and shining. Plates of butter, yellow as summer. And at the far end, as though this vision of abundance needed to be crowned with something unbelievable, were cakes with white frosting, pies filled with berries, sugar glittering on their surfaces. For a long moment, no one moved. The women stood frozen in the doorway, too stunned to enter. For years they had been trained to think of food as something snatched in desperation, fought for in long queues, rationed in pitiful ounces. Now, here it was, not hidden, not guarded, but offered freely. The guard at the entrance, a young American with an almost shy expression, made a gesture with his hand. "Take, eat," he said in slow English. The women looked at one another in disbelief. Litzel felt tears sting her eyes before she even stepped forward. Her hands trembled as she picked up a metal tray. She expected a reprimand, a slap, a command shouted in a foreign tongue, but nothing happened. The guard only nodded, waiting patiently. She moved along the counter. Her instincts screamed at her to take as little as possible, to hoard what she could, to expect the worst. She chose one slice of bread, a spoonful of stew, a single apple. That was already more than she had eaten in days back home. Yet when she sat at the long wooden table and tasted the bread, soft, rich, almost sweet, she broke down completely. Tears rolled down her face as she chewed slowly, afraid that swallowing would make the miracle disappear. Around her, other women sobbed openly, their hands shaking as they lifted spoons and knives. Some ate greedily, desperate to fill the emptiness in their bellies. Others held food in trembling fingers, staring at it as though unable to believe it was real. The sound of quiet weeping filled the hall, mingled with the clatter of cutlery. Litzel thought of her mother back in Dresden, standing in line for hours to buy a crust of bread. She thought of her brother's hollow body under a thin blanket. And she could not understand how the same nation that had bombed her city into ruins could place such abundance before her without condition. That night, back in the barracks, she opened the notebook she had carried secretly since her capture. By the light of a single bulb, she wrote in careful script, October 1945. Today I saw more food than in the last 3 years of my life. The smell of butter returned to me like a forgotten dream. I tasted sugar and remembered childhood. I do not know whether to be grateful or ashamed, but I know this: I will never forget the sight of those tables. The following morning, when the doors of the cafeteria swung open again, many of the women hesitated. Some whispered to each other, convinced that what they had seen the previous day had been a performance, a cruel joke staged by their captors to deepen their shame. Surely it could not be repeated. Surely abundance could not be given freely to those who had been branded the enemy. But there it was again. The same smell of roasted meat, of coffee strong enough to sting the nose, of bread fresh from ovens. The same long counters, not lined with meager rations, but with trays overflowing. Bowls of fruit, pans of potatoes, plates of butter. Nothing had changed. The women froze in the doorway, struck once more by disbelief. Slowly, almost fearfully, they stepped forward. This time the guard did not need to gesture. They knew what to do. Yet as Litzel moved through the line, she could not shake the suspicion that the abundance might vanish, that some harsh punishment might follow. She took carefully measured portions, though her body begged for more. When she sat at the long wooden table and tasted the stew again, her tears came more quietly. But as she ate, her eyes caught a sight that stunned her more than the food itself. At the end of the meal, when the trays were collected, the guard scraped leftover food into bins. Half-eaten apples, slices of bread untouched, stew poured out still warm. Litzel stared, horrified. In Germany, children had scoured ruins for crumbs. Families had fought over potato leaves. Her own brother had wasted away for lack of nourishment. And here, in America, food was thrown away as though it were nothing. A wave of grief hit her so sharply she felt dizzy. She whispered to the woman beside her, "Do they not understand? Do they not know what hunger is?" The other woman, a former schoolteacher, shook her head. Perhaps they never truly suffered it. Perhaps abundance blinds them. Back in the barracks that evening, the women could not stop speaking of it. Some were angry. "This is cruelty in another form," one said bitterly. "They feed us, yes, but they show us how little it means to them. They waste what our families would die for." Others argued differently. "No," said the teacher, "this is not cruelty. This is ignorance. They cannot imagine hunger as we know it. That is why they waste." For Litzel, it was both. She remembered her mother scraping the last of a flour sack, remembered neighbors fighting over a carrot, remembered the silence of hunger that hung heavier than bombs. To see food discarded without thought tore open those memories. Yet the next morning she still walked into the cafeteria. She still took her tray, and once more she ate until she was full. For the first time since the war began, she no longer felt her stomach ache at night. Strength returned to her body, even as guilt gnawed at her mind. Her notebook filled with lines written in a careful, trembling hand. Day after day the miracle repeats. Bread, meat, coffee, fruit. I no longer recognize my own reflection. My face is no longer hollow. Yet I cannot erase the image of food thrown away. Every apple wasted here could save a child in Dresden. Every slice of bread could give life to someone I loved. I eat, but I do not eat in peace. For the German women, the cafeteria became a place of contradictions. It gave life to their bodies, even as it deepened the wounds of their memories. It was proof that the world they had been taught to imagine, the barbaric America of propaganda, was false. And yet the abundance itself was almost more painful than cruelty would have been. They had expected starvation. Instead, they were forced to confront the reality that their enemies' prisoners ate better than their own families back home.
By the third week, the cafeteria was no longer a place of fear, but of ritual. The women lined up with their trays, shoulders still stiff, eyes still darting, but they had grown used to the abundance that awaited them. Yet each day, the astonishment returned in small ways. The glisten of butter spread thickly on bread, the steam rising from stew, the bright color of apples piled high, as though no scarcity had ever existed. It was in this space that something even stranger began to happen. The guards started to speak to them, not with commands, but with words. Simple, halting English meant to be repeated. One morning, as Liesel moved slowly through the line, a young American soldier pointed at the bread and said clearly, "Bread." She froze, tray in hand. His eyes were not cruel, only expectant. After a moment she whispered, almost against her will, "Brot." The soldier shook his head gently, smiling. "Bread," he repeated. Liesel felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She looked away quickly, but the word lodged in her mind. Later, when she returned to the barracks, she scribbled it in her notebook. Bread equals brote. Others experienced the same. Guards pointed to apples, to coffee, to butter. Apple, coffee, butter. The women stumbled through the sounds, their accents thick, their tongues unused to the shapes. Some resisted, refusing to speak. But more and more, voices could be heard repeating the strange syllables in the line, awkward and shy. The cafeteria became a classroom. Food was no longer only sustenance, but vocabulary. One afternoon, Yvonne, a woman from Munich, sat across from Liesel with a bright red apple in her hand. She held it up and said carefully, "Apple." The women at the table laughed, not with cruelty, but with relief. Laughter was a rare visitor in the camp. Soon, each woman held up her food, naming it in broken English. Milk, potato, pie. For a moment, the tables echoed not with silence or weeping, but with words, repeated over and over, clumsy yet determined. Liesel joined them, whispering, "Bread, coffee, apple." Each repetition felt like both surrender and strength. Surrender because she was taking in the language of the enemy. Strength because she was no longer voiceless. At night in the barracks, the women continued their practice. They pointed at objects and tried to name them. Table, chair, door. Their accents twisted the words, but they laughed together, correcting one another. The guards, hearing the noise, did not silence them. Some even encouraged it, leaning into the doorway and saying new words, which the women eagerly scribbled into scraps of paper. For Liesel, this was a revelation. Hunger had silenced her, stripped her of everything. Here, in the unlikeliest of places, she found herself learning again, her mind as nourished as her body. Still, the contradictions never left her. She would write in her notebook, "Today I learned the word butter. I wrote it carefully, as though it were precious. Yet in Dresden my mother cannot even find bread. Why should I learn the enemy's words while she starves? And yet, I cannot stop. Every word feels like a piece of life returning to me." The cafeteria, once a symbol of humiliation and confusion, had become something more complicated, a place where enemies exchanged not only food, but language. And in that exchange, the German women discovered a truth they had never been taught, that even in the heart of captivity, they could be treated not only as prisoners, but as human beings capable of learning, laughing, and speaking anew. By the time winter approached, the cafeteria had become the heartbeat of camp life. It was more than a place to eat. It was where the German women confronted memories they could never erase, and where they stumbled into a future they had never imagined. The lessons in English grew bolder. Guards now spoke in simple phrases instead of single words. At breakfast one morning, a tall soldier with sandy hair pointed at himself and said clearly, "My name is Robert." He then gestured toward Liesel. The women around her turned, waiting. Liesel's face burned. She opened her mouth, hesitant, and whispered, "My name is Liesel." The soldier grinned, repeating it back to her. For the first time in years, her own name had sounded like a badge of dignity rather than a prisoner's number. The other women clapped softly, some even laughing with joy. They began to imitate the sentence, one by one. "My name is Anna. My name is Gertrude. My name is Yvonne." The room filled with voices, names spoken not in shame, but in fragile pride. Yet with every word came a wave of memories. Liesel remembered how, in Dresden, food was rationed with strict cards, names written in ledgers, identities reduced to what little each person could claim. Her brother's name had been crossed off lists after he died of hunger, and here, in the enemy's cafeteria, her name returned to her with warmth. The contradiction made her throat ache. One evening, as snow drifted softly outside, the women sat at their tables long after eating. Conversation grew louder, laughter mixed with tears. They practiced sentences the chaplain had written on the board. "I am hungry. I am full. I am tired." The women repeated them, some exaggerating, others whispering shyly. Then someone, no one later remembered who, said out loud in German, "Do you remember last winter at home?" Silence fell. One by one, they began to speak. Anna told of standing in line for 6 hours to receive a single potato, only to find the sack empty when she reached the front. Gertrude described giving her daughter crusts of bread soaked in water to soften them, pretending it was soup. Liesel spoke quietly of her brother's final days, how his body grew lighter each morning until he was gone. The cafeteria walls seemed to echo with these confessions. Tears ran freely. The Americans, hearing the sobs, did not interfere. They let the women grieve, sitting together with full stomachs, but hollow hearts. Then, almost as if to defy the sadness, Lisa lifted her spoon and said in broken English, "I am full." Her voice trembled but carried a kind of fierce courage. The others repeated after her, through their tears, "I am full. I am full." Laughter mingled with crying. They were both full of body, empty of memory, alive and grieving at once. That night, Liesel wrote in her notebook, "Today I spoke my name. Today I remembered hunger. Today I laughed and cried in the same breath. The Americans give us food, and with it they give us our voices back. But every spoonful still tastes of sorrow. I do not know how to live with both." The cafeteria had become a strange sanctuary, a place where they mourned the dead and learned to live again, where shame and gratitude sat side by side at the table. And in the quiet of those winter evenings, Liesel began to realize that captivity had given her something she had not expected. Memory, made bearable, not erased, but carried with the strength of bread and words. By early 1946, the cafeteria no longer felt like enemy ground. It had become the place where German women prisoners began to rediscover pieces of themselves long buried under rubble and grief. The food filled their bodies, but it was the words, those awkward, halting English words, that began to fill something deeper. One morning, after breakfast, a chaplain entered the hall carrying a stack of papers and pencils. He tapped the table to gather attention and spoke slowly, carefully. "Letters. You may write." The room went silent. For a moment, the women thought they had misunderstood. Letters? To Germany? Could words really cross oceans scarred by war? The chaplain repeated, pointing from the prisoners to the papers, then across the ocean with his hand. "Letters. Home." The effect was immediate. The women pressed forward, trembling hands reaching for pencils. Liesel clutched her sheet of paper as though it were treasure. It had been months since she had written anything personal. She stared at the blank page, overwhelmed. Slowly, with painful effort, she began, "Liebe Mutter." The German flowed easily, but then she hesitated. A memory struck her, the guard at breakfast pointing to bread and butter, repeating English words until they stuck in her mind. Liesel swallowed hard and wrote carefully beneath her German sentences, "I am safe. I am well. I am Liesel." The words were shaky, the spelling uncertain, but they were there, in the enemy's language. Around her, other women tried the same. Some filled entire pages in German, afraid to attempt English. Others added a word or two they had learned. Bread. Friend. Thank you. The sight of English letters in their own hands felt surreal. Weeks later, replies arrived. The women clutched the envelopes as though they contained life itself. Liesel tore hers open with shaking fingers. Her mother's words, written in faint ink on fragile paper, spoke of hunger and ruins. "We stand in lines for hours. There is little to eat. The city is rubble. But your letter gave me strength." And at the bottom, "When I saw the English words in your hand, I wept. I knew you were alive, and that you were learning, even in captivity." Liesel pressed the letter to her chest, tears falling freely. For the first time she felt a strange pride. Her mother had not condemned her for learning English. Instead, she had taken comfort from it. The cafeteria became the place where those letters were read aloud, where women whispered translations to one another, where tears fell into cups of coffee. It was also where the Americans began to notice how hungrily the women clung to language. Guards started bringing chalkboards, writing simple phrases. My name is, I am hungry, I am tired, I am happy. The women repeated them in chorus, laughter breaking through when someone stumbled. The act of speaking together, of learning side by side, made the cafeteria echo with something other than weeping. Yet the contradictions never left. Each evening, as trays were cleared and food discarded, Liesel's chest tightened. She could not forget her brother, gone forever for want of a crust of bread. She could not erase the image of her mother standing in ruins. And yet here she sat, stomach full, hands ink-stained with new words, writing letters that crossed the sea. In her notebook she wrote, "Today I wrote my first English sentence to my mother. She wept when she saw it. I eat until I am full, and I send words across the ocean. I do not know why the enemy gives me both bread and language, but I cannot deny that it saves me." The cafeteria, once a hall of shock, had become a hall of voices. Voices of women rediscovering their names, their stories, and their connection to a homeland they feared lost forever. By the summer of 1946, the cafeteria had transformed into something the women never expected. It was no longer just a place of food, no longer just a classroom of hesitant English words. It had become the center of life in the camp, a place of laughter, of letters read aloud, and astonishingly, of music. One evening, after supper, the chaplain rolled in a heavy wooden cabinet with a crank on its side. At first, the German women exchanged nervous glances. Was it some kind of machine? But when he placed a record on top and turned the crank, the room filled with sound. Music crackled out, a scratchy but unmistakable melody. A cheerful tune carried across the wooden tables. The women froze. It had been years since Liesel had heard anything resembling music. In Dresden, before the bombing, there had been a piano in her home. She remembered her mother playing softly in the evenings, filling the rooms with warmth. That piano had been reduced to splinters in the firestorm. Music, to Liesel, had died with the city. And now, suddenly, here it was again, alive, vibrant, echoing through the cafeteria. The chaplain, smiling, pointed to the chalkboard where he had written simple lyrics in English. Slowly, awkwardly, he began to sing. The words were simple. Good morning, good day, we are friends, we are here. The prisoners stared in disbelief. Then one by one, voices joined in. At first, the German women sang timidly, their accents twisting the sounds. But laughter broke out, and soon the hall rang with a strange chorus, English words sung in German voices, uneven, clumsy, but full of life. Guards clapped along, tapping the rhythm on the tables. The sound of song drowned out the silence of the barbed wire outside. Liesel found herself singing too. Her voice trembled, but she felt something shift inside her chest. The act of making music again, of raising her voice not in fear, but in song, was almost unbearable in its beauty. Tears blurred her vision as she mouthed the foreign words. When the song ended, the women erupted in applause, not for the chaplain, but for themselves. For the first time in years, they had sung together. Some laughed until they cried. Others wiped tears silently, clutching each other's hands. From that night forward, music became part of the cafeteria. Once a week, after meals, they sang. The chaplain taught them simple hymns and folk songs. The women stumbled through the English, sometimes mixing German words in, but the meaning was clear. They were alive, and they were singing. But as always, joy carried its shadow. After one song, Liesel sat quietly with her notebook. She remembered neighbors in Dresden humming lullabies to hungry children, voices breaking with despair. She remembered the silence of nights when bombs fell and music was swallowed by screams. She wrote, "Today I sang in English.
My voice did not sound like my own. I remembered the piano that burned, my mother's hands on the keys. How strange that I should find music again here as a prisoner. How cruel and how merciful that my captors gave it back to me. The cafeteria now echoed with three things: the clatter of plates, the broken syllables of English, and the fragile songs of women rediscovering what it meant to be human. And Liesel knew she would carry that sound home with her, across the ocean, across the ruins. Proof that even in captivity, life had found a way to sing again.
By late summer of 1946, rumors swept through the camp like wildfire. Soon, the women would be sent home. Ships would carry them back across the Atlantic, back to Germany. The words felt heavy, almost unreal. Home. But what was left of home? Letters still trickled in, written on scraps of fragile paper, telling of ruined streets, collapsed roofs, and hunger that never ended. For many, the thought of returning was as frightening as it was comforting. The cafeteria, once the place of shock and then of laughter, became the stage of farewell. Each meal seemed more vivid, as though the women were trying to memorize the sight of it: the glistening bread, the steaming stew, the endless coffee. They whispered to each other that they must hold on to the memory, for surely they would never see such abundance again once they left America. Liesel sat one evening with her tray untouched for a long time. She stared at the slice of pie before her, its crust golden, its filling sweet. She had grown strong again in this place. Her hollow cheeks had filled, her body had regained strength, but she could not shake the knowledge that her mother in Dresden still stood in lines for scraps, that children in her neighborhood still begged in the rubble. To eat while thinking of them felt betrayal, and yet to waste the food given to her felt ungrateful. Finally, she lifted the fork and ate slowly, committing the taste to memory. Each bite was both gift and grief. The guards, sensing the tension in the camp, became gentler. Some even spoke of Germany, asking questions in slow English. The women answered in fragments, piecing together sentences from the words they had learned. City destroyed. Mother hungry. Family alive. Maybe. The Americans listened, sometimes in silence, sometimes nodding with sympathy. In those last weeks, the chaplain organized one final gathering after supper. The phonograph was brought out, the chalkboard filled with lyrics. This time the song was a hymn of farewell, simple and solemn. The women sang, their voices low, blending with the deep crackle of the record. Guards stood at the back, some with bowed heads, others quietly humming along. When the song ended, silence filled the room. No one moved. Then slowly, the women began to applaud, not for the chaplain, not for the guards, but for themselves. They had survived. They had found voices again. They had laughed. They had sung. Liesel pressed her hand against her notebook. Inside it were the words she had collected over months: bread, apple, butter, sky, friend, thank you. Simple words, yet to her they were treasures. She whispered them quietly to herself, as if afraid to forget. That night before sleep, she wrote, "We will leave soon. I do not know what waits me in Dresden. I fear hunger will meet me again. But I will carry these memories, the bread, the music, the words. They will remind me that even enemies can show mercy. And perhaps one day I will tell my children that I learned to live again in the cafeteria of my captivity." The cafeteria doors would close to them soon, but the taste of butter, the sound of English words, the echo of song, all of it would travel with them across the sea, stitched into memory, unerasable. The morning of departure came quietly. The women woke to the familiar sound of boots on gravel, the clang of doors opening, the call for roll. Yet everything felt different. This was the last day. Tomorrow they would no longer walk into the American cafeteria. Tomorrow they would board trucks, then trains, then ships that would carry them back to Germany. The guards led them, as always, into the long hall. Liesel paused in the doorway, as if her eyes wanted to drink in every detail one final time. The sunlight poured across the counters, illuminating rows of loaves, bowls of fruit, steaming pots of coffee. The smell of butter and roasted meat rose into the air, sharp and rich. But this time the food seemed almost unbearable. Every loaf was a reminder of her mother's empty cupboard, every apple a ghost of her brother who had died for lack of one. The women moved slowly down the line, their trays heavy, their hearts heavier still. When Liesel sat at the table, she touched the bread, but did not eat immediately. She watched the others. Some devoured their food hungrily, as if trying to store strength for the unknown that awaited them. Others ate with tears running silently down their faces, knowing this was the last time they would taste such abundance. A young guard, perhaps sensing their emotions, spoke gently in broken German. "Heute letzter Tag." The women nodded, some lowering their heads. Then switching to English, he pointed to the bread and said softly, "Bread." Liesel looked at him, her throat tight. After a pause, she whispered back, "Bread." The word trembled, heavy with memory. She reached for her notebook, turned to the first page, and ran her finger over the words she had collected. Sky, bread, apple, friend, thank you. One by one, the women began to say them aloud, as though reciting a prayer. Apple, coffee, butter, sky. Their voices overlapped, some strong, some weak, until the cafeteria was filled with the chorus of their broken English. When the chaplain appeared with a phonograph, many thought they would not be able to sing. Their throats were too tight with grief. Yet when the record crackled to life and the familiar melody filled the room, voices rose. Weak at first, then stronger, until the hall echoed with song. They sang in English, they sang in German, they sang with tears streaking their faces. The guards stood quietly, hats in their hands. It was not a concert, not even a hymn, it was a farewell carved in sound. When the music ended, no one spoke. The women stood, leaving trays behind. Some reached out and touched the wooden tables, the chalkboard, even the counters, as though to carry the feel of the cafeteria with them. Liesel tore a small scrap from her notebook and slipped it into her pocket. On it she had written one sentence in shaky English. "I will not forget." As they walked back to their barracks to gather their few belongings, Liesel glanced back one final time. The doors of the cafeteria closed slowly, shutting away the smells, the warmth, the impossible abundance. She knew that when she opened her eyes tomorrow, she would see only the gray sea and beyond it the ruins of Dresden. But she also knew she would carry this place with her. The shock of food given freely, the words learned over steaming trays, the sound of women's voices rising together in fragile song. In her notebook she wrote that night, "Today we said goodbye. I ate bread and remembered hunger. I spoke English and remembered silence. I sang and I remembered grief. Tomorrow I will go home, but part of me will remain in that hall, for it was there in the enemy's cafeteria that I remembered I was alive."
The ships that carried the women away from America groaned across the Atlantic. The sea stretched endlessly in every direction, gray and heavy, as though reflecting the weight in their hearts. Each woman leaned against the railings, clutching her thin coat, staring eastward toward a homeland she both longed for and feared. For Liesel Müller, the journey was a blur of salt wind and restless sleep. At night, she dreamt of the cafeteria, the golden bread, the smell of coffee, the sound of voices repeating strange words in chorus. She woke with the taste of butter still on her tongue, only to find the ship's rations thin and cold. She hid her notebook beneath her blouse, terrified it might be taken, but no one bothered her. That notebook was her greatest treasure, filled with words she had learned in captivity. Bread, apple, sky, friend, thank you. When at last the ship reached Europe and the women disembarked onto German soil, the contrast struck them like a physical blow. The harbor reeked of smoke and sewage. The streets they traveled through were hollow, buildings bombed to their skeletons. Hungry children begged at every corner. Families searched rubble for scraps of wood to burn. Liesel walked through Dresden days later, her heart breaking with every step. The city she remembered had vanished. Houses stood roofless, blackened walls reaching toward the sky like broken arms. Her mother met her with tears. Thinner than Liesel remembered, her hair streaked with gray. Their embrace was both joyous and painful. "You are alive," her mother whispered, voice trembling. "You are alive." But as they sat together in the kitchen, if it could still be called a kitchen, with only cracked walls and a small iron stove, Liesel realized the truth. There was almost no food. Her mother boiled potatoes when she could find them. On other days they survived on watery broth made from turnip peels. Bread was rare, sugar a memory, butter a fantasy. Liesel hesitated, then pulled out her notebook. She opened it carefully, as though revealing a sacred text. Her mother's eyes widened at the sight of English words written in her daughter's hand. She read them aloud slowly, her accent thick. Bread, apple, sky, thank you. Her mother pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling. "You learned this there?" she whispered. Liesel nodded. Then, almost shyly, she turned to the last page and showed her mother the sentence she had written on the day of farewell. "I will not forget." Her mother traced the letters with trembling fingers. "Nor should you," she said softly, "for this too is part of your life." In the years that followed, Liesel married, rebuilt a home, and raised children in the shadow of ruins slowly repaired. Yet she never forgot. Whenever she baked bread, whenever she saw an apple glistening in sunlight, whenever she heard a song sung in a foreign tongue, the memory of the American cafeteria returned. She told her children, when they were old enough to understand, "There was a place after the war where I was a prisoner, and yet in that place I ate more than I had in years. I laughed again. I learned strange words. I sang. It was in the enemy's cafeteria that I remembered I was human." Her children listened wide-eyed, unable to imagine a world where their mother, captured and broken, had found dignity among strangers. But Liesel knew. She carried it always, the shock, the guilt, the gratitude, the taste of abundance against the memory of hunger. And in her heart, the cafeteria would never vanish. It remained a hall of contradictions, mercy and shame, sorrow and joy, captivity and freedom. A place where she learned that, even in the darkest aftermath of war, humanity could be found in the simplest of things: an apple, a slice of bread, a word spoken patiently across the gulf of hatred. She never forgot.